Salve, Omnes, I am Ruminus, and today we are talking about intuitive mechanics for video games. Intuitive mechanics are often linked with guiding mechanics, and also flow, yet intuitive in this context means that the mechanism is designed to teach the player. Many games since the late 1990s have often replaced intuitive mechanics for deliberate, explicit tutorials, which typically feels clunky and obnoxious and really interrupts the flow, especially in the beginning of the game. The best way to introduce new enemies, hazards, powers, etc. is to place the player in a spot where they see the object or they see the requirement in some way, but they have no real direct interaction with it, or it's a very limited environment where they get to play around with it. Weaker design is forcing the player to receive some sort of negative or hindering results, such as the enemy hitting them so they actually see what the attack is and does, because the game then forces them to learn the mechanic without being able to experiment with it, and they get hurt because of it. There's a negative impact, and I had no idea how to plan for this. That's not fair. Intuitive mechanics are sometimes useful if they injure or kill the player, but the game should immediately restore the negative effect so the player is not actually hindered or feels cheated for not knowing how the game operates. Alright guys, the voiceover is recorded at a different time, and I got quite sick, so my voice is going to sound a little weird, but we're going to power through and deal with it. In teaching, there is explicit and implicit instruction, where explicit is directly explaining a concept, but implicit is where the student learns from patterns what they've already learned, and deduction by attempting to use the concept. There are times when implicit instruction works well, like Crash Bandicoot's bridge level, where the red planks will fall, but the first time the player encounters them is when the other planks will save the player, so there's actually no damaging or negative impact from this concept. There are also times where the explicit instruction is just the easier or possible option, like Pokemon explaining that the player will need certain badges in order for higher level Pokemon to obey the orders. Spyro the Dragon has mixed intuitive design, where the game's opening cutscene gives all the information to a player at a glance without directly telling them. There are 1,200 gems to find, and the enemies are made of gems. The player may not understand what this means during the cutscene since they have no context for it, but then the dragons, which the player must save, will give direct instructions to the player. Sunder does a wonderful job of incorporating both styles of teaching. When gaining a new ability, the character will automatically do the action and finish with a few seconds to not take away control for too long, but then the game will come up with text afterwards explaining what or how the upgrade happens. I don't have a fairy. Oh no. Hey buddy, what are you doing to that rock? Alright, I got a fairy. Take that, everybody. I don't want a fairy anymore, this thing's annoying, leave me alone. I just want to play the game. Intuitive mechanics are, by name, all implicit instruction, and games should implement them as much as possible. Most people do not like to stop everything in order to listen to a conversation about something very simple. Intuitive mechanics should be simple, reversible, and quick. Players want to experience the world and experiment with their abilities, not have to go through game school to learn the basics. In older games where memory space was limited, voices were impossible, and text was rare, all instruction was implicit, but not always well done. These intuitive mechanics were from a limitation of technology, not from a lack of desire on the developers, as games soon saw explicit instruction when the technology allowed for voiceovers, text, and tutorials. This lack of technology also led to many bad examples of intuitive teaching, as implicit education is difficult to implement properly and not just make a labyrinth of mysteries. Developers were often not teachers, so they didn't know how, or didn't care how to, properly implement situations to encourage inferencing decisions. Intuitives also align with the guiding mechanics as they propel the player into what the developers want without directly commanding them. Intuitives include small walls letting the player know that they can jump, chimes letting the player know that something important just occurred, watching NPCs do certain actions and the results to let the player know what actions are available and the result, and so on. Intuitives are best used for introducing hazards or secrets, and usually the basic actions and movements will be figured out by the player by just messing around with the buttons. Having dead, injured, trapped, or otherwise impeded bodies or objects around a hazard let the player know to be cautious. Making the player activate a switch or lever with the activated object in sight but not in reach helps the players see what the result exactly is. Intuitives differ from guidings when the expected action or result isn't clear. Footsteps leading to an enemy are guiding, as they are bringing me to that area, but footsteps that can't be followed are intuitive, as it forces the player to prepare for combat, stealth, a cutscene, or whatever. Intuitive mechanics can range from visuals, animations, sounds, to speech. Visuals all focused around giving a static sight to show an aspect of the game, such as a door already being open, but with a key in the lock to show that there will be locked doors in the game. I had no idea that anybody played this game anymore. Huh, interesting. Hello, Scarf friend. Hope you're doing well. Animations are dynamic visuals, like dangling objects flowing severely in the wind to show that the wind will have an effect in the game, perhaps even to the player. Sounds are, you guessed it, sound effects, which alert the player about something unusual or new, such as creaks or thuds, to alert that an enemy may be coming soon. Speech is language from any character to hint at an aspect of the game, such as an NPC telling the player that the room has odd decorations. Intuitive speech does not give direct, explicit directions to the player, such as the Spyro example from earlier, but gives a clear hint about the game. Oftentimes, games will push the player into a specific region designed for the tutorial, and this is where intuitive mechanics can thrive the best. In these areas, the player can experiment with various actions and movements, and the game can mix in the other types of intuitives to help guide the player to discover what the game is trying to do. The best ways to design these areas is to have non-threatening, non-debilitating impediments like small ledges and pits, which don't cause damage but can't be walked over, so that the player gets the idea to try and jump. There can be objects out of reach to show that the player can throw, use telekinesis, or shoot things. There could be small openings for crouching, or enemies fighting against an NPC, or lasers activating doors, or cracked walls being destroyed, that kind of thing. Some of these are guiding mechanics as they show exactly what to do, but if the guiding mechanic is not explained directly, it also becomes intuitive, and that's kind of where they intertwine. A tutorial level is good for the basics of the game, but there also should be tutorial areas whenever something new is added, but these new tutorials should only be a small area for a simplistic understanding of how the new concept operates, and to help the developers design an area that funnels the player into testing the new gameplay aspect. For implicit learning, there needs to be a safety net for failure. Part of intuition is the scientific method of trying things in different patterns to achieve a desired result, and failure is a part of that, but it shouldn't be punishing. If the player needs to reload after trying, or is hounded by enemies or NPCs shouting to hurry up, it causes stress, frustration, and people just want an answer at that point. I'll continue the tutorial discussion in another video, although know that the intuitive and tutorials should be very intertwined. Part of what fails in explanations is either the implicit instruction is too vague or the explicit is overbearing. The Witness is a literal puzzle game, but nearly everyone who plays the game, including me, will often say that they needed to look up how a puzzle was working, because the intuitive design was either too vague to understand at all, or the rules that the player first developed were false and only worked for the easier ones, and proved to actually be false confirmation bias when the later puzzles. No way! Use the left analog stick to move, not like every other game known to mankind? Who would have guessed, huh? Soma, for whatever reason, immediately tells the player that the left analog stick is used to move around, as if games for the past 20 years, since the conception of the analog sticks, have not used the left stick for movement. The first thing anybody does when getting a new gadget, toy, or game is to push all the buttons and do some intuitive learning to figure out what they do. The Mega Man Battle Network series is rather notorious for its complete lack of intuitive mechanics. Every game begins with a long, unskippable tutorial, where the game explicitly tells the player every basic control and function of the game. The player needs to jack in and keep going until busting some viruses. Seriously, what, did it not check the language on this one? This one's disgusting. The game interrupts the flow consistently during the 3 to 5 mandatory fights to explain what each button and function does. Every time a new mechanic is introduced, like the upgrade system, the game again jumps into an explicit instruction about how it all works. Where the form changes and dark chips may benefit from some direct instruction, the introduction is incredibly slow and tedious. A simple solution to this is to make the player go through the mandatory fights, but the first fight has no help or assistance whatsoever. The game could then read what the player does, or use the score system already implemented to skip over some of the tutorials, as they are clearly unnecessary for someone who gets a high rank. The game could also make the player watch a short, scripted fight where an NPC uses the character and shows off all the techniques available, then uses the explanation that the programs are all working as intended. A third and typical option is to mention that the tutorial area is available, but completely optional. The Battle Network games do have intuitive design with the music and sounds, where the stronger attacks typically have louder and more menacing sound effects, the tense situations have more dramatic music, the upgraded versions of enemies have different colors, but most of the base mechanics and puzzles all have direct instruction. These games are designed with a younger audience in mind, but the intellectual capacity of children and teenagers is actually quite adept at recognizing patterns. Children do need a little bit more explicit instruction, but using implicit instruction at basic parts helps them begin to develop their problem-solving skills and skills of deduction. The more confusing and complex parts of a game will require explicit instruction, but the more basic functions should always be implicit, with options for tutorials for those who are struggling to understand or who may have some cognitive issues with abstract thought or deductions. Limbo does a marvelous job for its intuitive design and never utters a single word. The game begins with a forward path, instructing the player to move forward. The camera moves along with the character, so the player never has to worry about controlling the view. When the player quickly comes to a ledge, there is an incline below, which causes the player to slide until it hit a level piece of ground. The player then learns that they will have to sometimes go down, and that slanted ground will cause the player to lose control in lateral motion, but that the level ground will return the control. Directly afterwards is a small pit with spikes. This teaches the player that they can jump and will need to do so to avoid certain obstacles, but also teaches the player who fall that they will respawn to a nearby location, that the game autosaves, and that death does not require the player to do so much work to get back to where they were. Shortly beyond the pit is a grabbable box, demonstrating that the player can grab and manipulate certain objects, and the character will reach out to show that something can be grabbed. The game manages to show all the base mechanics within the first 3 minutes of gameplay, and there is no explicit instruction for any of it. The game later on uses visuals for its hazards and animations to show that the enemies are around and tracking the player. The game always gives the player enough space to investigate when first encountering a danger, and the investigation allows the player to experiment and learn on their own. Intuitive design and implicit teaching are hard to implement seamlessly, but are best for actually engaging your players. Having the game pause, take away autonomy, and explaining every single minute detail in the game really gets old really quick, and it hurts replayability. Implicit is best for teaching basic or simple features or mechanics, but it can be used also for complicated or more intense things, although it is harder to implement properly with thousands or millions of players, each with different and unique educational backgrounds and thinking processes. Explicit tends to be needed for more complicated mechanics or features, or ones that are harder to deduce because there are so many variables or reasons as to why it may have happened. It is a difficult balance to achieve, and I failed often as a teacher, especially in the beginning, and so I have to constantly review, and that's something that if you're designing mechanics, you have to constantly review. Is this actually intuitive? Do I really need explicit teaching? So the more things you add enacts Murphy's Law. If you design an obstacle with only one possible solution, then the player will figure out the answer. If there are multiple actions or rationales for a solution, it may discourage usage of the other aspects or allow the player to have false truths confirmation. They may believe something is true in the game that is not actually true because there are multiple reasons why it may have happened, and instead of believing the true thing, they believe in the fake one. And so they don't really understand how the game works, and they get frustrated when they try to do that thing that they actually thought was true, but it's actually wrong. Thanks everybody for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell to be notified of future videos. If you have any constructive criticism of things that you think that I missed, things that you think I got wrong, if you have examples of good, bad, or unique intuitive mechanics in video games, please leave in the comment section below so that we can continue this discourse. But until next time, where we talk about tutorials, Wale te omnes.